Welcome to another episode of Eric Wade Whiskey Studies, and we're currently studying the business of Scotch whiskey. And in this episode, we're going to be looking at the Scotch Whisky regions as codified by the Scotch Whisky Association. And we went over the Scotch Whisky Association in our last lesson. Now, if you look online, just Google Scotch Whisky regions or Scotch Whisky map, you may see an unofficial map which separates the islands from the Highlands. While I would sort of personally agree that I think that the islands should have their own designated region. Currently, according to SWA, all those islands are part of the Highlands, and the reality is, if you have a whiskey from the islands, they have a distinctive character to them, which really makes them quite different than mainland Scotch whiskies. So it's my hope that eventually, one day, they have enough distilleries on them that they will get some other sort of designation. But unfortunately, sometimes classifications can sort of get ingrained and becomes tradition, and people are slow to change. For example, the Bordeaux region still has the 1855 classification. Of course, that's a classification of, or ranking of classification of distilleries. Some are higher than others, and there's a lot of money involved in classifying something as a first, second, third, fourth, or fifth growth, and a lot of money, and of course that gets into politics, and everybody's got their economic interest to it. Maybe someone's got some economic interest in remaining being called Highland single malt Scotch whiskey rather than Orkney, because Orkney can put Orkney in front of single malt Scotch whiskey rather than use Highlands. However, it seems Highlands has a lot more clout than Orkney. In fact, some Highland distilleries even consider a Highland to be a higher ranking than Speyside. And so even though they're located in Speyside, they like to use the more general Highland for their designation. So in this video, we're going to be looking at the official classifications and regions of Scotch whiskey. Oh, and while I am going over my notes, enjoying a little dram of Johnnie Walker Double Black, the Breakfast of Champions. It is 95 degrees Fahrenheit, and it is 2:30 in the morning when I'm recording this. So I have it on a little bit of ice, and I recently did a video on whiskey on ice and the pros and cons and weaknesses and strengths and all that. But you drink whiskey how you want to, and if you're so inclined, join me in a glass of Johnnie Black. The Scotch Whisky Association recognizes 5 different whiskey producing regions in Scotland. Formally, in the law, SWR 2009, these are the protected regions of the Lowlands, the Highlands, and Speyside, and protected localities of Campbellton and Islay. Islay comprises of the Isle of Islay and Argyll. Campbellton, comprising the South Kintyre ward in the Argyll and Bute Council, as that ward is constituted in the Argyll and Bute, the Electoral Arrangements, Order 2006A. One of the things I'm not going to get into, because these regions also have perhaps some political associations with them, and we're just interested in Scotch. And then there's the breakdown of councils and wards, getting more into geographical designations of Scotland, and I'm not super interested in that for our current study. So the United States, we have obviously the United States, and then we have 50 states. We have 48 continuous states here in the mainland. And then each state is broken down by counties, and then counties are broken down into cities. And some other cities might also be further broken down into barrios. So just as we have our breakdown of regions and geographical indications, so does Scotland. But for our intent, we're really just concerned with the 5 major regions. The Lowlands comprising that part of Scotland that is south of the line dividing the Highland region from the Lowland region. By the way, if you're ever in Glengarry Distillery, there's a road that goes right through the property, and that road separates the Highland from the Lowland. And so where the actual distillery is at is in the Highlands. But where the dunnage warehouses are located on the other side of the road, that's actually in the Lowlands. So Glengarry, the spirit is, it's kind of funny. Glengarry spirit is actually made in the Highlands, but is aged in the Lowlands, but they're considered a Highland distillery. The Highlands, comprising the part of Scotland that is north of the line dividing the Highland region and the Lowland region. Speyside, comprising the wards of Buckie, Elgin City North, Elgin City South, Fauconbers, and Lanbride. I may have mispronounced those, Fochabers, and Lanbride. Wait till I do a series on Japanese whiskey and see how I do a pronunciation of that one. I'm sure that'll be off there as well. Forres, Heldon, and Lake, Keith and Cullen and Speyside Glenlivet of the Moray Council, as those wards are constituted in the Moray electoral arrangements, Order 2006B, and the Badenoch and Strathspey ward of the Highland Council, as that ward is constituted in the Highland electoral arrangements, Order 2006C. Now here's where we get a little bit technical in terms of the geographical designation. We like to put it in a map and say that line go from there to there. However, if you're going to get specific about a region, you got to nail down the details. We have this issue here in California. We have, so in the wine business, we have AVAs, American Viticultural Areas. And sometimes one AVA is considered to have a higher status than another AVA, and some winery will get upset when the lines are redrawn, or when the lines are drawn, say with a new AVA, and their winery is just barely outside that line. And so then, of course, there's all the legal battles. And then there's whether the issue of a particular winery is or is not within an AVA, because kind of like Glengarry, part of the winery seems to be in the area and some of it's not. So if you're going to draw a map and designate someone being in and someone being out, you got to get real specific. The line dividing the Highland region from the Lowland region is defined as the line beginning at the North Channel and running along the southern foreshore of the Firth of Clyde of Greenock, and from there to Cardress Station, then eastwards in a straight line to the summit of Earl's Seat in the Campsie Fells, and then eastwards in a straight line to the Wallace Monument, and from there eastwards along the line of B998 and A91 roads until A91 meets the M90 road at Millenthort, and then along M90 northwards until the Bridge of Arun, and then along the River Arun until its confluence with the River Tay, and then along the southern foreshore of that river and the Firth of Tay until it comes to the North Sea. Now, of course, I'm telling you this, and you already knew all this. It's like, well, no, duh, of course. That's how you divide the Highlands from the Lowlands. But there you go. There's the technical aspect of where they draw the line. And if you're ever in Scotland and you're going to visiting distilleries, as I have a couple times, you start to become more familiar with these highway designations of M90 and so forth. Anyway, let's move on. Historically, single malt Scotch distilleries were categorized by the region in which they produced their whiskey. Traditionally, characteristics and style of malt varied somewhat depending on the region. More recently, with the resurgence of whiskey's popularity in the last few decades, whiskey marketeers have promoted whiskey regions as a way to communicate regional variations in a similar way that wine producers have for years. However, this belief of regional styles of whiskey is becoming more tenuous as Speyside and Highland distilleries start to produce peated whiskies. Previously, peated whiskey tended to come from Islay or some other distilleries. The usefulness of regional classification has, of late, been questioned by some in the whiskey industry. But so the thing is, that takes place in the wine world as well. There are things you can do to get your wine to seem like it was from somewhere else. For example, California is very warm, as it is today. A lot of sunshine, so it's very, very different than, say, from Burgundy or Bordeaux. However, if you use larger canopies to get more shade, if you find little microclimates that are cooler, where you get a nice ocean breeze, you can get your wine, say a Pinot Noir, to ripen a little slower, ripen a little bit later, and there's some other things you can do to get your wine to be a little bit more Burgundy-like. And of course, with changes in climate worldwide, now some of these other regions, say in France, are getting warmer as well. So the issue of regionality, yeah, there's going to be some exceptions to the rule. There's going to be some that don't fit the classic profile. I recently visited Scotland, and one of the things I noticed is a lot of the distilleries, let's say they've got as an example, let's say they have 4 core range whiskeys. These are the whiskeys you see everywhere. They then have special bottles only available at the distillery that will actually be very, very different than their core range. And one of those differences is oftentimes a peated whiskey. So it's kind of funny. There are actually a lot more peated whiskeys being produced in the Highlands. By peat, I don't mean just a slight little whip. I mean really full-on peated whiskeys. And so those are actually, and I'm a peat head, those are actually really, really nice to find and bring home. And after recording this series, I'll be doing a whole series of videos of my trip to Scotland, and I'll be reviewing some of those. It's really some fantastic treasures. So I wouldn't use a highly peated whiskey from the Highlands as a test to test someone to see if they could figure out where the whiskey came from, because that is an atypical whiskey, right? It's not a classic Highland. So in wine world, in the whiskey world, you have classic profiles, people that make up, say, the majority, and then you have those exceptions. But those exceptions don't mean that the general profile or typical profile should be ignored. Just because you can find, a few Burgundy-styled Pinot Noirs in California doesn't mean, well, there's no difference then between California and Burgundy. No, there's a huge difference. Just because you can find a few heavily peated whiskeys in the Highlands or some unpeated whiskeys on Islay doesn't mean you dismiss the entire distinction of typical regionality, right? It just means there are exceptions to the rule. And welcome to planet Earth. Most rules have exceptions. The first use of whiskey regions as a classification was to create a distinction between whiskeys made in the Highlands and those made in the Lowlands. The Highland line was created after the 1784 Wash Act. The sole purpose of this was in order to create different legal arrangements for distillers in the Highlands and Lowlands, primarily for excise or tax purposes. It was hoped the Wash Act would increase legal distillation in the Highlands and reduce smuggling. Some of the new provisions of this act, such as the permitted size of stills, strength of wash, and speed of distillation, meant that whiskey of 2 different styles was then being produced in the Highlands and the Lowlands. At the time, it was agreed that Highland whiskey was far superior than Lowland whiskey. So if you didn't see my series on the history of Scotch whiskey, this is why studying history of Scotch and wine is important. It really lets you know why these classifications are made, and that it's not just about the profile of the whiskeys. There are actually tax issues as well. But if the reason has changed and the lines that were drawn on the map are no longer true, no longer reflect a reality, maybe you have to reconsider the lines, and that can be difficult to change because people Once something gets designated as something, people like to stick to that. Which is the reason why the 1855 classification of Bordeaux hasn't changed, other than there was one winery, or one chateau, Mouton Rothschild, that was added in 1972. But that's a lot of politics, that's a lot of money, and that's another topic. By the 1800s, 3 more whiskey regions were being more widely recognized: Campbelltown, Islay, and Glenlivet. Campbelltown and Islay were recognized simply due to the high concentration of licensed distilleries operating there. With regards to Glenlivet, it had a historical reputation due to smuggling in the area, but also because of, arguably, it was home to the first whiskey brand, Usher's Old Vatted Glenlivet. Distilleries spread over 30 miles started to adopt the name Glenlivet for their whiskeys. George Smith, owner of the first licensed distilleries there, namely Drummond and Minmore, was the supplier of the whiskeys for the Old Vatted Glenlivet brand and was understandably not happy about this. In 1858, he enlarged his operation and consolidated Drummond and Minmore to create Glenlivet Distillery. In 1871, he registered the name Glenlivet Distillery at Stationers' Hall in London. However, loopholes in the law meant that other distillers could now only use the name Glenlivet as a prefix or a suffix. By 1890s, the boom time for distilling on Speyside, some 28 distilleries were using the Glenlivet prefix or suffix in their name, such as Abelard Glenlivet, Macallan Glenlivet, Balvenie Glenlivet, and so on. In fact, some distilleries still have their legal name with Glenlivet in it, even if they don't put the Glenlivet on their label or in front of the distilleries. For example, when I visited Abelard Distillery in July 2019, it was mentioned that their stationery and the mailing and shipments, stuff like that, so for the address and name, still have Glenlivet attached to the name Abelard. This stood for almost 100 years, as it was not until the 1980s that distillers, brand owners, and whiskey writers started to really look at the use of regional classifications for whiskey as a way of helping consumers differentiate between various single malts. It was at this time that the main whiskey regional names were starting to become widely used as descriptors: Lowlands, Highlands, Speyside, Islay, and Campbellton. So, the Johnnie Walker Double Black. This is not a complicated whiskey. It's not requires a lot of thought. It's not one you sit there sort of analyze to death. I'd say it's a simple sipper that has a little bit of peat to it, a little bit of smoke to it, a little bit of fruit to it. It's under $30, at least here in California. I've already reviewed this one. I like Johnnie Walker Black. If I'm traveling abroad, it's something I go to, that and Macallan 12 and a hotel bar, something I keep an eye out for. So if you're interested in a full review, I'll put a link. But the one I really like is the Johnnie Walker Black 2049, which is at 49% ABV. And that was a Blade Runner edition. That was absolutely fantastic. And I really wish they would make a full version of that one. But you can check out my review of that whiskey as well. The Speyside region is the most densely populated region in the world. In terms of the number of distilleries in one area, the Speyside region is home to more than half of the distilleries in operation in Scotland. For many aficionados, Speyside is seen as the spiritual home of Scotch whisky. Traditionally, the Speyside region was split into 8 smaller subregions, these being Rothes, Strathila, Lossy River, Finehorn, Dufftown, Deveron, and Speyside Central. In terms of aromas and flavors, Speyside whiskies are traditionally unpeated and, generally speaking, are very fruity and sweet. These are often matured in a mix of sherry and bourbon casks. It should be noted that Speyside falls within the borders of the Highland Region, and therefore Scotch whiskies distilled in the Speyside area may be described as Highland or Speyside. Many distilleries in the Speyside region opt for the Highland Region descriptor on their labels, such as the Macallan. The Highland Region is defined as anything north of the dividing line that stretches from Greenock to Dundee, being a vast and all-encompassing region Taking in the islands, including Jura, Arran, Orkney, and Skye, the Highland region is often subdivided, and specialist whiskey books are sometimes whiskey menus and specialist bars. The subregions being Northern Highlands, Western Highlands, Eastern Highlands, and Southern Highlands. It should be noted that Islands is sometimes another subregion in such a list. However, as noted before, that is not official. The most northerly distillery on the mainland is Wolfburn Distillery in Thurso, and the most westerly distillery on the mainland is Ardnachmarken. In the Loch Aber region of the Highlands, the most westerly distillery, not on the mainland, this one is difficult to pronounce. It looks like Abain Derge Distillery, but you know, Gaelic's words are not going to be anything how you would pronounce them, let's say, in American English. So I watched several videos and tried to get how to pronounce this. It looks like it says, I'm trying to get close. Give me a break, all right? Abain Derge. I've watched several videos listening to people in the UK, Scotland, pronounce this. Something similar to Abain Derge Distillery. So give me some credit for at least looking it up and trying. So, the most westerly distillery not on the mainland is Abain Derge Distillery on the Isle of Lewis. At present, the most northerly distillery is not on the mainland, is Highland Park Distillery on the island of Orkney, beating Scapa Distillery by about a mile as the crow flies. However, this title may soon be taken by Shetland Real Distillery on Shetland once they start producing whiskey in the near future. The most easterly distillery is Glengarry Distillery north of Aberdeen. The highest distillery in terms of elevation is Dalwhinnie Distillery at 1,164 feet above sea level. Notice I said Glengarry and not Glengarriach. Some other well-known whiskeys such as Dalmore and Glenmorangie are from the Northern Highlands. The vast landscape of the Highlands gives way for equally varied flavors and aromas, covering salty sea-sprayed coast to heather-covered landscapes and everything in between. There are also a handful of Highland distillers that will use a peated malt such as Ardmore. Typically and generally speaking, the Highland single malts are robust and fruity with a light, gentle peatiness. When it's really warm, really hot, one of the things you got to accept is the ice is going to melt. Your whiskey is going to, unless you're just slamming it, there will be some variation in the flavors you're going to experience due to that. So, everything in life has pros and cons. You're either going to drink no whiskey on a really hot day, or you're going to drink whiskey on a really hot day and the alcohol will be exaggerated. Or you're going to cool it down. It will be more refreshing. It'll be enjoyable, but you're going to have some inconsistency in your glass due to the ice melting a little bit. You make your choice. You drink your whiskey your way. Personally, I'll go with the ice or not drink it at all. Once the industrial home of whiskey production in Scotland, there are now only a handful of distilleries in the Lowland region. However, there are plans for new distilleries in the region. There are several famous lost distilleries in this region. Bottles of whiskeys from these lost distilleries or closed distilleries can sell for thousands of pounds due to their rarity and the fact that they can never be recreated. Auchentoshan Distillery in Glasgow is one of only a couple of distilleries who triple distill their whiskey. This makes the spirit very light and delicate in flavor, typical of other lowland single malts. The most southerly distillery is Bladnoch, which in 2015 reopened and started producing again after closing in 2014. And in fact, Bladnoch just opened their visitor center towards the end of my trip in July 2019. However, due to being too busy and that I was on my way heading back home, I didn't have a chance to drop in there. But perhaps my next trip to Scotland, I'll drop and check out Bladnoch. Islay is often described as a malt whiskey lover's paradise. The small island off the west coast of Scotland is home to 9 distilleries and growing. The whiskies from Islay are famed for their pungent and peaty nature, peat being abundant on the island, was the typical fuel used for the island. Historically, these whiskeys are revered for their smoky and medicinal flavors and aromas. A handful of the island's distilleries do not use peat or use very little peat, and the whiskeys are still very maritime and coastal tasting, but balanced with fruity notes. The Kildalton Coast distilleries, Ardbeg, Laphroaig, and Lagavulin, are renowned for their briny flavor and full-bodied peatiness. The distilleries on the north of Islay are more delicate with less of an attack of peat. Campbelltown, once a real hub of whiskey production with over 20 distilleries during the 1880s, this locality now is home to only 3. During its peak production time, Campbelltown single malts were famed for being robust and peaty. Springbank is a world-renowned whiskey from there and endures to this day, producing 3 distinct styles of spirit. Springbank also owns and operates Glengarry Distillery, which was reopened in 2004, over 8 decades since it closed. Alrighty, so that's our lesson on the regions of Scotch whiskey. I would say the best way to experience and really understand the regions of Scotch whiskey is to go there. Get in an automobile. Learn if you're from the United States. It can be a little intimidating to drive on the opposite side of an automobile and drive on the opposite side of the road, but I highly recommend it. Within a day or two, you get comfortable. You know, the roundabouts can be a little challenging at times, but I found I really liked it and really enjoyed it and felt quite comfortable once I got there. But as you drive, when you're in the Lowlands, when you go over to Arran, when you go over to Campbelltown, and go to Islay, you go to Speyside, you go to the Highlands, take your automobile on a ferry, and the ferries are huge. It's just it's almost like a cruise ship, and head over to Orkney. You really get a sense of the place. You really do get a sense of the transition of what these different regions are like, visually, geographically, topographically, and experiencing the whiskeys from where they are made. It's really a fantastic experience, and so the best way to get to understand the Highland or the Speyside or Lowland or even the islands is to actually go there and not just look at a map. Anyway, that's it for this particular study. In the next video, we're going to be looking at some of the more current developments in Scotch whiskey business. If you subscribe to this channel, I want to thank you very much. If you haven't yet subscribed, but you like watching my videos, I would greatly appreciate it if you would subscribe. Give this video a thumbs up and share with your friends on Facebook, Twitter, and other social network channels. And until next time, cheers. Hey, if you like my review, be sure to check out these other whiskey videos.